Friends should say, hey you. I'm going to do this one on the fly. This is not going to be as well put together as my friends in the mud flood and Tartaria research community are normally doing. And Philip and Martin and Lee and CK and Philip was just talking to someone whose name escapes me, and there's UAP. There's a whole bunch of others, and of course Wise Up always gets a mention when I'm talking names for people who've inspired me along this way. But particularly, I was just listening to a conversation by Philip and this new name that's come on the block. Shout out to him. He's done a lot of research. He's pulled together other people's research on where these star forts are, and he claims that there are a couple of thousand of them already on their file. What caught my attention was that he is hypothesizing that the Tartarians met their end in the Netherlands or in Holland, and that immediately got me thinking about where I was brought up in South Africa. Just quickly to say that in Cape Town, South Africa, there is a most beautiful star fort. We all know it. It's called the Castle. The military use the shape of the castle, the five-pointed shape of the castle, as a military logo. So the imprint of the castle would be the equivalent of a major's rank in the army. It's very highly thought of. Now, for some time, I've been saying to my friends that the castle in Cape Town doesn't make any sense, because in terms of the history, we're taught, because it was said to be built. They say they started the building of this version, this current castle. There was an earlier incarnation of it, and I'll try and get into some of the mud that they've thrown around on that one. But apparently this castle that I'm going to show you today was construction started in 1666, or I-666. And believe it or not, they built this magnificent castle, monumental castle, in 1666. In just 10 years. I think we'd struggle to do it in half that time with all the machinery we have today. But in 1666, there were a few hundreds of people. They'd come aboard ships. They didn't have much about them and so on. But they built something that has weathered the worst storms and a whole bunch of other stuff for 400 years, near enough. So they tell us, right? I find this already very suspicious. Now, if you do join me in the chat, I'm going to try and ignore the chat because it'll throw me off my thread here. I want to try and keep this succinct. I don't want to waste your time. I have about an hour, maybe less now. I took a little bit of time to cut my hair. Gave myself a haircut. It's long overdue. It's been a while since I took the clippers to myself, but I think it was needed. The barbers weren't doing me right. Anyway, back to the castle. So, built in about 10 years, and I'll show you some photos of it, and you will immediately recognize that this castle has suffered from the flooding of mud. I'm going to go further and to give you some sense, if you don't want to call it evidence, certainly some sense that the entire Cape Town area was flooded in a single deluge, and the area is now known as Cape Flats because the area is so flat. You know, it's beneath the very famous Table Mountain. But the area around there is known as the Cape Flats, and I'll show you some interesting images in a little while. So that's the first interesting and telling clue. You see, the original history is written that some 20, 30 years before, the original Dutch sailors came down to the Cape and with a view to setting up a victualling or refresh station. That's what we were all taught in school. Now, because it was simply a stopping off port on their way around to the lucrative shipping to the Indies and so on, to India, with all their spices, the idea was obviously for your ship to be able to pull in a little like a Formula One race or an IndyCar race, pull into the pits, have a quick, refuel, maybe let the sailors off and have some fun with the locals. I don't know, but let them refuel and off they go. And the fort built in Cape Town was designed to be like a, I suppose a point of protection from perhaps bandits, other sailors or whatever. But to provide a safe place for stocks and so on and so forth. What would absolutely make sense and what accords with the original history is that there was a fort of sorts built, they claim, out of mud and clay, wood and mud, or clay. And this was obviously right at the water's edge, what would be known as Cape Town sort of harbor, if you like. Now, what they've done is they've taken what is recognized as I'll have to read it so that I get it right. It's called there was an original castle. I'll read this. Redoubt Danehoop was a square demi-bastioned clay and timber redoubt built fort constructed in the mouth of the Salt River leading to Table Bay in January 1654. It was built in 2 months, from January to February 1654, a fort. And it formed part of the defenses of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and it was their replenishment station established under Jan van Riebeeck back in 1652. The purpose of the station was to supply ships traveling between the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies. The redoubt was armed with two 12-pounder guns, and in 1654, Van Riebeeck informed the directors that in addition to the Fort de Goede Hoop, which is the Fort of Good Hope, I'll get to that, a redoubt named Danehoop, standing at the Salt River for the protection and reinforcement of the Table Bay, has been fully placed in position of defense. Now that makes sense to me. In addition to covering the approach to the Salt River mouth, the Danehoop served as a signaling station to warn the fort of approaching ships. In 1661, Danehoop had been abandoned and fallen into disrepair. So that's just 7 years later. It had been and it was repaired after a warning that French fleet might pass the Cape, and a second redoubt named Sandhoop was built nearby in 1666 again. However, both had been allowed to fall into disrepair, and Danehoop was demolished 6 years later in 1672. Nowadays, for some reason, Danehoop is sometimes confused with Fort de Goede Hoop. That's interesting, isn't it? So bear this in mind. You've got this Danehoop, you've got this Fort de Goede Hoop, and then you've got the castle. And I may not have made that explicit, but at this point in time, historians are trying to tell us that there's three different buildings. There's the redoubt at the mouth of the river, at the Cape, at Table Bay. There's this Fort de Goede Hoop, which I'm going to click on the link right now. I'm sorry I don't have high-tech gear here, so I don't have a camera on my desktop, and I gave my laptop to my daughter a few years ago to go to university, so I have to put up with this. The Fort de Goede Hoop, or Fort of Good Hope, was the first military building to be erected in what is now Cape Town, built in 1652, and was in use until 1674, when it was superseded by the Castle of Good Hope. So you've got the Fort of Good Hope, and there's only a drawing of it. It's a sketch, and it looks pretty damn impressive, but it was abandoned and superseded by the Castle of Good Hope. Now, I'm going to read this quickly. The fort was built by the Dutch East India Company when it established a replenishment station. And now, this fort, I mean, you start to kind of get into when you think about star forts and you see how impressive they are and how much the star fort in the castle in Cape Town looks like all the star forts in Europe and the ones in the Netherlands and so on. Then you go, okay, so it is the same. There is the same culture did build the stone construction that we call the castle today. But historians need to tell us that there wasn't only that castle, there was another one, but not a castle. It was called the fort. It looked very much like the castle from the sketchings. It's not a perfect rendition, not perfectly the same thing, but very much like the castle. Now, I think the reason why this is uncomfortable for historians is because this castle was considered to be on the water as well. Also, I should say this Fort of Good Hope was considered to be on the water. And because of the mud flood, I'm contending, because of the mud flood, it changed completely the layout of that area in the Cape, and therefore they lost the water, lost its access, its immediate access to the fort, and the fort basically became landlocked, where before it would have been on the water. And they had to explain that away. I've read another historical account. I know it says here that they just abandoned the Fort of Good Hope. So let me just read that. So you within the fort were living quarters, a council chamber for the and sick bay, workshops, storerooms. Cannons were placed on the ramparts, and nearby a stream was diverted and channeled to form a moat around the fort. Being built of earth, the original one, the fort needed frequent maintenance and repairs, especially after heavy rains. So instead of that, they went and built something that's going to last for 500 years. So in January 1666, work began on a stone fortress to replace the fort. It took 8 years to build, and it was not until 1674 it was ready for occupation. I won't suggest what I think on that. So on May the 2nd, 1674, the council resolved to demolish the original fort, except for some stores which were retained for a while longer until their contents had been moved to the castle. Yeah. Real story, bro. Nowadays, for some reason, the fort is sometimes confused with the redoubt Danehoop, which was built some distance away, you see. So there is this kind of, for some reason, we're confused. But I think actually there were two buildings. There was the original Danehoop, and there was the original fort / castle. The Danehoop thing, that makes sense as the victualling station, the replenishment station, and so on, because it was like right on the water. I think this castle was right on the water at that time. Let me quickly show you some imagery to kind of help this along. I do thank you for stopping by and visiting me on this occasion. I hope this is useful. Right. All we want to do is just show you for reference so that you know what's what. This is the Western Cape and the Cape of Good Hope, which is the very most southern point apparently of Africa. This is the Cape Peninsula, and Cape Town is here. This area, as you can see, is called Cape Flats. And I contend that the mud flood came this way and washed through here, and this entire area, which when you visit it is as flat as anything. Table Mountains here. You've got the Black Mountains, or the Swartberge, this way. But I'm going to show you another little image that I found really fascinating. This one here. I mean, you see how that is. This is a blow up now. This is Table Mountain. This is Cape Town's harbour here, and this whole area here is washed through with beach sand. In fact, over here we've got Boulders Beach, which if you visit is just these massive, massive boulders that are said to have, well, we don't quite know how they got there. But I would suggest to you now that this is what we would call moraine. You know how they say in the Ice Age that, you know, there's this moraine, which is like the stones and the rubble and boulders that get drawn down by the glacier? I think that's bollocks. I think it's probably mud flood related activity. And if there is, if mud flood is caused by a changing of the vibration or a shaking and so on, then yes, large, massive boulders like these would be shaken loose and would be caught up with the thing. Now, this is, let me just show you firstly before I show you that. I'm not as well organized as my friends who do this all the time. I had an image here I wanted to show you, but it doesn't want to come up. Let's just take you to a image here. This is an image of the fort. So I mean, as you can see, it's a typical fort. 1 second. Sorry about that. This is a typical star fort. As you can see, 5-pointed star. These have all got very famous names if you're South African, Katzenellenbogen and this and that, and they're all Dutch. I heard my son might be coming home in a second, so I really need to get to my key point on this. So this is the inside of that fort that you've just seen, and here, if you're into the mud flood research, you will be able to tell immediately we've got classic signs of windows at ground level, and there's plenty of this kind of evidence all over this silly construction up to what is obviously being created as a new front door. There's some other even more amusing images that I'll probably be able to pick one up quite quickly for you. Of how these builders, who were the most incredibly, you know, diligent in terms of how their architecture came together, didn't think about some very important aspects when you're building. And this is one of them. 1 second. Here's the image coming up now. Apologies for the delay in my technical mouse. But again, you know, they've just shut these up and go, oh, let's not bother too much with that. And, you know, we'll just throw a couple of stairs up on the outside here rather than the original construction. I mean, one might argue these are laterally added as a fire escape, so I won't hold on to this image for too long. Okay, so that's an important sort of evidence for me that firstly that this building was originally at the water's edge. It is now landlocked, and it is so because there was a deluge. It has swallowed up some of this building. I do apologize for my tardiness here. It has swallowed up some of this building. It's quite evident, and I'd ask you to go and have a look for yourself to improve the quality of these images in your mind. But when you look along here, you can see that the floor level has risen. And this building has, over the centuries, had many opportunities, and they admit that they've done lots of work to keep this building, as it were, going. So I suspect they dug out quite a lot of what's there. But you can see guys on YouTube going on tours down into the bowels of this building, and good heavens, how difficult would it be if you're this close to sea level? Because we are almost at sea level. This is why it's called the Cape Flats. You really don't rise up anywhere at all when you drive around this part of the Cape. So you're almost on the water table and sea level. So why would you build down 10 foot into the ground and then still be seeking to find your foundations below that in 1666? when all you had was shovel and spade and a few exhausted and scurvy-ridden, sailors down with you. Really, there couldn't be, according to the history, there couldn't be more than a few hundreds of people, and yet we would take thousands of men and man-hours and machine hours to do something like this in the modern time. And we certainly would think twice about trying to dig 20 foot down. You should see how long it's taken them around the Battersea Power Station to dig down into the mud, because obviously around Battersea Power Station in London, it's a Tartarian power station. It is mud flooded, and they are building new apartments and stuff in the shadow of that building finally. But I've been watching them for the last year and a half, maybe longer, digging 6 stories into the floor, into the ground, and they still haven't gotten to ground level. So this is 1666 or I-666, and they built this then. I don't think so. But here's the gist of this is the kind of crux of my video, and I'm grateful that you've been listening to me for this long. But the key thing I think here is that the Dutch and the British are kind of Bessie's friends, in the dark circles of, the upper echelons of how things work. The Dutch king and queen and the British establishment and so on are all in the same foul bathroom at night. And so I am at a loss to understand why the British would then, having let the Dutch kind of have their time down in the Cape, and then allowed, as the history tells us, that they'd allowed these Dutch settlers to then travel into, not allowed, but they'd chosen to travel into the depths of South Africa, into the hinterland, and then, well, what, 100 years later, 150 years later, at the end of the 19th century, Britain decides that it wants this land. And the story we're told is that they realized that there was a lot of gold and values and jewels and diamonds and so on. And this is why they then invested in the Boer Wars. Now, the historians will be able to put me straight on this, right? But my history classes tell me that there were 2 Boer Wars, and that I think, if memory serves me, that the British committed, I think, to the second one, if not the first, they committed some 400,000 soldiers. It is to this date the British Empire's largest commitment to conflict ever. So a few thousand farmers or Boers or voortrekkers, as they were known. The voortrekker means front puller, and these are the people that they went up in ox wagon. Apparently, they went up in ox wagon up into the into the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. These were known as countries of their own right back in the day, right? And they went up into these places, or they claimed these places. They created these countries out of this land. So we're told, and they had no industry to talk of. They had no, access to military hardware unless it was, being ferried in by the CIA. I mean, they weren't formed. The Dutch, it was being, farmed in. But I'm not aware of that. What I'm aware of is that these few, apparently, Dutch descendants, and they called the Boers, or the farmers, which is the Boers in English, they put up such a stiff resistance that the British in the First Boer War, got their asses kicked. How does that work? How do you get a few... I tell you why. Because the British turned up in... Apparently, because they turned up in redcoats. and they were such an easy target for the Boers, who all they had was they had they had their caravans and a few farmhouses and so on, but they didn't have anything else. And yet the British thought it so important that they then came back a few years later. It was the early 1899 or 1901 or something like that. And then they conducted the Second Boer War, and it was a massive, massive conflict, such that they even set up the original, the very first concentration camps. And the Boers, the Afrikaners, or particularly the Boers, are still very, very bitter about this. So I'm at a loss to understand now why it is that the British would have committed so much effort. And of course, obviously, people can say, well, it was just what we were taught, which is that, the historians, the British wanted the gold, they wanted the diamonds, they wanted Kimberley, they wanted the Witwatersrand, the gold seams of the Witwatersrand, but I don't buy that anymore. And I'm starting to wonder whether the Tartarian Empire wasn't already in Africa, and they were just mopping up, those areas where people had survived through. I mean, the whole Cape Dutch, all those beautiful Cape Dutch houses and so on. That has to be from a previous time. What about I've kind of lost my thread now. My boys come home. Sorry. So, let me just kind of try and wrap this up then. My hypothesis is the possibility that people did flee from some persecution. These people that let's say we call them Tartarians, right, for now, and they did flee, and they were chased by the authorities, by the empire, because they didn't want for people to realize, or for them to get away with whatever, or get away with the knowledge, or get away unscathed. I'm not saying that these are the last people that the British Empire or the empires have been trying to wipe out. No, I suspect that other wars have had a similar agenda, but I'm just wondering whether this was the last major grouping of people, and that there were a lot more people that were wiped out than the few hundreds or thousands that are, typically reflected in the historians' accounts of the Boer War. So, was the Boer War, or were the Boers one of the last standing Tartarian groups? Oh, I should mention, I don't think of Tartaria as a white nation, okay, or a white thing. I think that perhaps people were far more intelligent back then, and they didn't concern themselves so much with skin color or the shape of someone's nose. It was more, we're humans, and that's it. So I don't, and so were they just chasing white folks up Africa? No, I don't know that that's true either. Are some of the dreadful British conflicts against the Zulu tribe and so on also an echo of the Tartarian genocide, if I can call it that? I don't know. I mean, I'm willing to speculate. I'm willing to have all of those ideas jangling around in my mind. But I wanted to put this out there because I think that the guys who have more time and more acumen for the research that I do, they would be able to pick up on some of these breadcrumbs that I'm throwing down and hopefully maybe build on that. Because I don't have a dog in the race as to whether or not I'm ex-Tartarian or we're ex-Tartarian. Or not. Whatever we are, I just want to know the truth. And you won't have heard me say this before, but I grew up in a town called Pinetown in South Africa, near Durban. And Pinetown has a suburb called New Germany. New Germany was the location of a concentration camp in the Boer War. But in 12 years of schooling in Pinetown, they never once mentioned that to me. I wonder who writes our history books, huh? Were the concentration camps, because we're told that the concentration camps were to stop the locals from resupplying the Boer fighters. So they put the wives and children and stuff into concentration camp. Again, should we buy this as yeah, that's the legitimate story as to why this was happening? I think the reason why they didn't tell me or teach us about it in school is because they're hiding something else to do with that. We know the concentration camps in the Second World War had a different agenda than the one we've been taught about. I'm starting to wonder whether the concentration camps weren't again about, these were re-education camps. These were, let's weed out those that are talking out of shop. Let's only allow those who agree to certain things and to to follow a certain educational ideal or whatever. I think it's worth mentioning here, unless you're a South African, you probably won't know this, but and I didn't know this until a few years ago, but there's a distinction in some people's minds between the Afrikaner and the Boer. And the Boer is said to be the original kind of dude who went up there, whereas the Afrikaner, no disrespect to any of my Afrikaans friends, but the Afrikaner is said to have sold out to the man, the European, or whatever. Whereas the Boer was always against the man. And the last true president of South Africa was a guy called Paul Kruger. And he was a flat earth proponent, by the way. And he also claimed that the British Crown owed the South African people billions in reparations. He obviously wasn't in the club. Anyway, I hope that's been useful to you.